From FL1 News, this is episode 189 of Inside the FLX. The backdrop of today's program is the Huntington Building in Seneca Falls. If you're unfamiliar, there has been a local fight to save that building from being demolished and replaced with a large-scale convenience store. While that fight seems to have come to a tentative conclusion, a lot of residents still have questions. The Huntington Building will likely become apartments or some form of mixed use, which is precisely what folks in historic preservation want to see. It's what they've been advocating for. They say it's the only plan put forward that includes keeping the historic structure intact. Today, we're going to discuss historic preservation, how it works, and how it happens. The short answer is that it takes a combination of private investment, grants, and tax credits to make historic preservation work. It's a lot more complicated than that, though. Opponents of historic preservation ask why and argue that progress shouldn't be stopped. However, it's undeniable that a growing number of policy and decision makers in the Finger Lakes are leaning toward historic preservation as a means of economic development. This hour, Aaron Tobin and Emil Bovey join me in studio. Bovey is a local attorney who has been a vocal advocate of historic preservation in Seneca Falls. Meanwhile, Tobin serves as Vice President for Policy and Preservation at the Preservation League of New York State. Before we get into that conversation, though, I'd like to thank today's show sponsor, DeSanto Propane. A lot of companies say they are locally owned, but very few have been owned and operated here in the region for as long as DeSanto Propane. They've been serving upstate New York since 1937, and over the last 80 years, they've established a reputation for reliability and dependability that sets them apart from the competition. Quick turnaround times, on-time deliveries, and a fourth-generation family-owned business. Learn more by visiting DeSantoPropane.com. Thank you both for being here. This is a really interesting conversation, and one that it's a continuation in a lot of ways. Emil, you've been on the program before. Aaron, this is your first time on the show. Obviously, Seneca Falls is the backdrop of today's conversation. But Aaron, I want to start with you. The Preservation League of New York State, that is where you're coming from today.
Yes.
Walk us through what the Preservation League does and what its role is in communities like Seneca Falls.
Absolutely. The Preservation League of New York State we're based in Albany. We've been around since 1974, when many preservation organizations were founded in response to urban renewal of the 1960s and excitement about the bicentennial coming up. But we work in all of New York's 62 counties, and we advocate for effective preservation policies at the local, state, and national level. We provide technical services. We offer grant programs, both our own and two partnership programs with the New York State Council on the Arts. We have an endangered properties list that's a biennial list called our 7 to Save. And we work closely with our 7 to Save every 2 years to really focus technical support and attention on those threatened sites. Local ones in this current round, the Manchester Roundhouse over in Manchester is one of our 7 to Saves right now. And then we have an Excellence in Preservation Awards program where we celebrate great preservation projects. So we've had several properties that have gone from a 7 to Save. We've been able to give them some grant funding, and then they become an Excellence in Preservation Award winner. So we're always excited about that.
And obviously, when it comes to preservation, because of the logistics, the local laws, and the sort of different players that have to be involved to make any rehabilitation work, it's got to be complex, it's got to be complicated, and I would assume that you guys in a lot of ways are sort of trying to help folks understand and help the developers get through the process as much as, providing different opportunities and ideas for renewal and rehabilitation.
Yes. So much of what we do is about partnership. Because we're a private nonprofit, we have some flexibility in terms of providing assistance and recommending certain people to help out with preservation projects. And we bring people together. We bring together interested parties. So if there's a community that's looking to save a building and a developer who we know has a solid track record in historic preservation, consultants to help with tax credits, preservation architects who can help make sure that the building stays true to its historic character, And then we bring in other partners. So we work closely with local and regional preservation nonprofit colleagues like the Landmark Society of Western New York.
So my next question, and this is one that it's a philosophical one, but it's one that we've talked about before here on the program, Emil. And I'll start with you on this one. When you're talking to folks in Seneca Falls or similar communities, what's the pitch for preservation as opposed to bulldozing and starting over?
Well, first of all, I think we like to use the word reuse and not preservation. So we're taking buildings that are part of history and the character of communities and finding a way to reuse them. And there's I defer to Aaron on all the factors that why economic and financial factors, why reuse as opposed to bulldozing. But I think Seneca Falls is a prime example of a place that's unique because of its history and its character. And so hopefully what's happening now over the last few months is we're recommitting ourselves to decades of commitment to reusing Seneca Falls buildings because of the history of its involvement in the industrial build-up during the 19th century, and most importantly because of the location of the Women's Rights Convention in 1848. It's really a unique place. The state, the federal, the local community over decades has committed itself to preserving the fabric of Seneca Falls. And you know, what I say about Seneca Falls is that Seneca Falls deserves the same credit that the Independence Historic District in Philadelphia enjoys. Whatever happened here in 1848 when women stood up in public and demanded equality and demanded the right to vote, that's as huge an event as the men in 1776 saying all men are created equal. So it's an important place, and it's important to Seneca Falls, and I think we owe it to history and ourselves to continue the process of maintaining the fabric, because people are going to come here. They want to come here, and because it's the birthplace of women's rights, and they deserve to see something of what it looked like in the 19th century. A lot of these buildings were built after 1848, but they need to get a flavor. And I think so far we've done a remarkable job. The Hall of Fame is certainly a good example of that, of creating this beautiful place. It's just a gorgeous place, and sometimes people don't really appreciate how beautiful it is here. You know, the old timers, the people that have lived there all their lives, the people that come here, there's an influx of new people that come here and they say, this is a great, beautiful place. We love it here, and we want everyone to join on that bandwagon.
And Aaron, beyond obviously the pitch itself to different folks who are involved in just living in these communities, why does reuse work, and why does it work so well in a lot of these communities where you already have buildings that are sort of part of the institution, they're part of the fabric of the community before anyone even takes over and starts a development project?
Because historic preservation and building reuse is all about community. It's all about connections among people, connections to the past. And I think more and more, and even before this current era, that's what people crave. You know, if you consider where people choose to live, where people choose to go, they want to go to a place they can get out of their car and walk around and experience something authentic. And I think that places like Seneca Falls have been proven to capture that sense of authenticity, and that's reflected in the historic buildings, that's reflected in Main Street. And economic studies have shown time and time again that that's what drives real sustainable economic development. So I think why preservation works is because people are starting to really understand that it's It's about heritage and history and community and sense of place, and it's also about economic development. It's about shopping local. It's about pedestrian-friendly communities. And as people try to develop places that have this kind of false sense of authenticity, the new urbanism and the false Main Street communities, it's really increasingly understood that some place like Seneca Falls is special, and we see that all over the state. We see that the places where the economy is strongest is where the community has made an investment in its downtown. It's made an investment in its historic buildings. It's supported its local businesses. And it's required perhaps businesses that aren't local to fit into the character of that community. If a CVS really wants to be downtown, they'll go into a Main Street storefront. But they're always going to ask to demolish and build new first. So, big business wants to find the cheapest, easiest thing to do. But we have countless examples of chain drugstores, chain department stores going into main streets and being very successful.
And is it one of those scenarios where, I think the perception is probably that it's more expensive to rehabilitate or reuse as opposed to demolish and start over, but does that necessarily always work out, or are there examples that you guys point to and say, well, look at the cost of both sides, because maybe it is a better value and a better investment for you to rehab or reuse as opposed to demolishing and building corporate or building new?
Yes. It's always in the eye of the beholder, and a developer or a cost estimator can come up with a wide range of costs and a wide range of options. But it's always better to use what you have. And when you're talking about rehabilitating an existing building, you've got all those materials in place. You don't need to pay for them. The labor cost is in the actual labor. You're paying people to do the work. You're not paying a company to ship a bunch of plastic over from someplace else. What happens when it's when people have the impression that it costs more to rehabilitate, a lot of times they're being given bad advice. People, architects and developers need to really understand historic buildings to properly specify what has to happen to them. And so more often than not, what we see is when a project is either gets kind of out of control expensive or is seen to be more expensive in the first place, it's because they're working with somebody who might not really understand what the building needs and start from there. Just like I believe you need to meet people where they are, you need to meet buildings where they are. And if you're not doing that, then you're going to get into trouble if you're trying to save it. So there's also a number of different incentives that are available, and those incentives, New York State is very lucky because we have a state historic tax credit, as well as across the country there's a federal historic tax credit. And that state historic tax credit, and thank you to Governor Cuomo and to the legislature for continuing to invest in that historic tax credit program. We've seen that make a world of difference, particularly in smaller communities in upstate cities along the Erie Canal corridor and in more rural areas, because that is often the difference in cost between building something new with plans you get off the shelf and coming up with something that can celebrate an existing building.
And I guess before we get into the different types of funding that are available through the state, I guess part of the follow-up to that last question is, what advice do you guys give to communities who are wading through this process and trying to educate members of the community about the benefits of reusing, rehabilitating, as opposed to building new and demolishing? Are there certain things that you try to tell them in terms, or certain pieces of advice that you try to give them to position them well enough to be able to educate the community about the benefits of reusing?
We like to bring in building owners and property developers and business owners who've done it before, so that they can talk to the community. In an ideal situation, they're in that very community, but maybe they're in a neighboring one. So I can think there's a village in the Mohawk Valley that was considering a National Register Historic District, so that small town, that village, could qualify for historic tax credits. And there was a lot of opposition in the community, and this was a community that had not seen National Register districts. Was very there wasn't any historic designation for miles around. And somebody who owned several buildings on the main street there stood up at the village board meeting and said, I want this because I want to invest in my community. I want to take advantage of these historic tax credits so that I can rehabilitate in my building, so that I can bring apartments in and I can put a restaurant on the ground floor. And I can receive the economic reward of owning this building. And now it's a National Register Historic District, and they have several restaurants on their main street, and I point to that community and others as an example of a place that really recognized that economic benefit. So that's one of the things that I talk about, and we can carry that message, but I think it's more powerful when it comes from a property owner, a building owner, a business owner.
And you mentioned historic districts. Are there certain local policies that you guys look for when you're talking to these communities to have in place so that they are able to not be pressured or not be pushed in one direction or another, and are able to actually make good decisions that are best for the whole community and preserving that rich history at the same time?
There are. We work in, I'm going to go through kind of the steps because it really depends, again, where that community is starting from. So in a case like the village I was just talking about, they had no designation or anything. So we start with the National Register, because the National Register is really all about the carrots for the building owners. It opens up tax credit opportunities, it opens up grant opportunities, and there's no additional review for a private property owner. You can paint your house whatever color you want, you can put an addition on, you have to follow your local codes, of course, but that National Register overlay district, it's not an overlay, the National Register Historic District is primarily all benefit. So we start there. Then when we're looking to communities, and another good example of how the National Register District can be helpful, there's a hamlet it's in Schoharie County, and there's a group there's a Dollar General that wanted to knock down a really beautiful, iconic historic house at a four-corner junction outside of this hamlet. And the Historical Society and members of the hamlet got together and wanted to fight the Dollar General. They wanted to keep their community, they wanted to keep their small town feel. And so they surveyed their downtown hamlet. They're now either on the National Register or about to be on the National Register to create that historic district. Will that ultimately stop Dollar General if they want to go there? It won't, but it encourages that community and that sense of place and that celebration of the history. So the next step for a community like that would be zoning. And we feel very strongly like local historic districts, and Seneca Falls is way ahead of the game because they have a local ordinance, they have a local historic district. But if you take a couple steps back between the local district and the National Register District, zoning is the front line, and that's the point of defense against Dollar Generals, to be quite frank, because right now Dollar General is tearing down a lot of historic buildings all over the state, and they're targeting rural communities. But it could be the CVS or the Walgreens or the Circle K, and that's what helps maintain that sense of place, and that's really thoughtful, considered planning. And that's all a community effort, because preservation and community planning, that all happens at the local level, and it's up to the community to decide what they want. You know, do they want their place to look like any rest stop off any thruway exit, you know, from here to California? Or do they want their place to be someplace that, you know, you get off the thruway and you make that special 5-mile detour because you want to go to that coffee shop and get out of the car and stretch your legs and check out the gift shop? Which is what we do. That's, you know, I don't live in Seneca Falls, but I've come here many times with friends because we're looking for a restaurant and we're on the road, and this is a destination because it has that Main Street character.
So let's get into the different types of grants and funding and all of that is available for communities that go down the path and do the right things. Walk us through what some of the main opportunities are for developers, for residents, whoever that may be, entire communities maybe, that can get funding to help ease the burden of some of these projects, because obviously any development is expensive, whether you're talking about building new or rehabbing something old. But there are opportunities, right?
Yes. The historic tax credits are the best and biggest tool in our toolbox. And the thing I love about historic tax credits is it's all private development. So it stimulates the economy and it stimulates private development, but it's really that developer, individual or company who's investing in the community. So there is a 20% federal historic tax credit, and that's 20% credit for qualified rehabilitation costs. So we're sitting in this beautiful historic school that I'm quite sure was a historic tax credit project. And so when they did the work to transform this building into offices and incubator space, they got 20% back as in the form of a tax credit. And usually what somebody does is bring in an investor who can use that credit, and it helps monetize and bring capital into a project. Now in New York State, we have a state historic tax credit, and that's another 20%. So you have 20% on the federal side and 20% on the state side, and now you're talking about a real incentive that, you know, to get 40% back on the rehabilitation construction costs of a project is pretty huge, and that's making a large difference. The current version of the state historic tax credit really came into being in 2009. It was initially passed in 2006, but over the last 9 years that we've had, the program that we know as the New York State Historic Tax Credit, which has been incrementally improved over those years, we've seen a real shift in historic preservation projects and in downtown reinvestment from big cities and big projects like down in New York and maybe a couple in Buffalo, maybe a couple in Rochester, to really spreading across the state. So we're seeing things happening in places like Geneva and Seneca Falls and Auburn, and as well as more in Syracuse and Rochester and Buffalo. You know, the big projects like the Hotel Syracuse and the Sibley's building in Rochester, but also the smaller projects are getting done, and that's because that additional 20%. So that's a huge incentive for income-producing properties that are on the National Register. One of my favorite tax credits is the historic homeowner tax credit. In New York, we have a historic homeowner tax credit. So if you live in your house and it's in a National Register historic district, and you're in a qualifying census tract, which means there's a median income qualifier. The median income of the census tract has to be at or below 100% of the state median family income. And essentially what that means is it's making sure that's for both the state income producing credit and the homeowner credit. And what that does is it makes sure that it's an economic development incentive. So unfortunately, there's some river towns in Westchester County that can't take advantage of these state credits, but they're also some of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. Communities like Seneca Falls and Geneva and Watkins Glen, they can take advantage of these state credits because they want that extra incentive and that economic development incentive. And this historic homeowner credit, if you need to fix your porch, if you need a new roof, if you need a new furnace or boiler, you can take advantage of our 20% state historic tax credit and get up to $50,000 back in the form of a credit And that can even come back to you in the form of a rebate if your adjusted gross income is at or below $60,000. So the homeowner credit, I could talk about it all day. It's accessible. You don't have to hire a consultant for it. It has changed neighborhoods. It's encouraged people to open up their front porches if they were enclosed. It's encouraged people to paint their houses, to restore their windows, to stay where they are in their historic neighborhood instead of moving, because it just takes the edge off that cost of historic building maintenance.
So, and it seems like part of this whole education and sort of community activism that's happening when we're talking about historic preservation is making it mainstream. It is making this thought process that we can preserve instead of building new, the first thought rather than the second or third thought with these different properties. Is that part of the messaging that you guys try to get out to local communities?
It sure is. It absolutely. And preservation, the idea of using existing buildings, reusing existing buildings is so multidisciplinary. So we want it to be at the top of everybody's mind, whether they're coming at it from a real historic perspective, whether they're coming at it from an economic development perspective, whether they're coming at it from an environmental perspective, because the greenest building is the one that's already built. And the idea that people are spending thousands and thousands of dollars to create these net zero buildings and green buildings out in the middle of, a greenfield development, when you've got bricks and wood and metal in an existing building that doesn't have to be created, it doesn't have to be shipped in, it doesn't have to come in on a truck. And there's so many ways to make those buildings energy efficient. So we want everybody to think about reusing a building first, just like people should think about fixing what they have before they throw it away. You have a broken lawnmower, fix it. Don't throw it away and buy a new one. You have a building with, a cracked window pane, fix your window pane. Don't throw it out and get a new window. If you have a building with a hole in the roof, fix the hole in the roof. Don't demolish the building.
Now, obviously, hearing all of that, and Emil, you've been really involved here in Seneca Falls and sort of being the messenger in a lot of ways to bring this information to different folks and these ideas that haven't always been first on the minds of those living in places like Seneca Falls. So I guess my question to you is, when you look at Seneca Falls present day and moving forward, given where Seneca Falls is now, what are some of the things that give you a lot of optimism about the direction, in terms of reuse and rehabilitation moving forward for the historic downtown corridor of Seneca Falls?
All right. Well, first, I want to say that the reason we're here today is because of Preserve Seneca Falls, which is a not-for-profit corporation that was created to educate the public about the advantages of reuse of buildings. And so we did ask for this podcast, and I think just listening to Aaron talk, this is consistent with the goal of Preserve Seneca Falls. So I think what we're thinking about here, I think we should all be heartened about the future here. And I think we have some projects going on right now that are just very exciting. And we shouldn't forget the Hall of Fame. It's a huge tax credit project, and it's opened up the whole south side of the canal along with the property that Mr. Bonifiglia owns. It's just gorgeous over there, and anyone who knew what that south side Sackett district looked like 2 or 3 years ago, what it looks like now, they should be very encouraged. And then we have the Huntington Building project, which is very exciting. And that's a project that will depend on tax credits to be successful. So we're gearing up now to assist home leasing with that project. And I might say that project deserves the same kind of community commitment that the Hall of Fame. It's a huge building. It's on the canal. It has all kinds of potential for different uses. So we're already seeing evidence that the town board is gearing up for assisting home leasing in that project. And there are other projects, some of which I don't feel comfortable in talking about, but they're buildings in the historic district. They're buildings that are eligible for tax credits. So these things are all happening. And, might just comment personally that I've been doing some volunteering at the Seneca Museum. So when Tuesday afternoons, I'm in there for a couple hours, and the people you meet are so excited to be here, and they're looking for things to do in Seneca Falls, and they're drawn here for whatever reason. And we're seeing the tour buses. I saw a tour bus parked outside the hotel this morning, and at the Seneca Museum last week, the woman told me that they were part of a tour and they were stopping a couple days in Seneca Falls. So these things are happening. It's good for the community, but these tax credits that Aaron is talking about and the advantages of reusing buildings, we're committed to that. And I really think it's the future of Seneca Falls, and I'm looking for a more and more beautiful place over the coming future.
Do you see Seneca Falls as one of those communities, and I guess this is a fair question for both of you, do you see Seneca Falls as one of those communities that can sort of lead by example for other communities around the state to sort of look at and say, they did it, this is how they did it, let's get on board with this, and let's sort of facilitate the same mindset?
Well, I saw in the paper that Clyde was starting a historic district, so I think that's very true, and certainly there are places that, not only in New York State, but I think that Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is I think it's in the province of Ontario, there's a place that 30 years ago they made a commitment, I may have been more, to transform their community, and now it's this gorgeous place to visit, and so they did that through a very complex and energetic process. So that, I think that's what's been happening here. These things don't happen overnight. We're ahead of the game here in many ways, but we'd encourage other communities in the locality, Waterloo, Geneva, Auburn, Clyde, Lyons. You see these things happening, and it's a wonderful thing to be part of.
And as we sort of wrap up here, Aaron, I just want to sort of a close to put a bookend on this conversation. What's the message to those communities who are listening, to the residents of those communities who really have the most power to affect change, to get out there and get energized about reuse as opposed to just embracing whatever corporate idea comes along? And it is an appealing, the idea of quick, easy, simple, clean development, for a lot of people who aren't in the weeds and in the thick of this stuff, feels and seems appealing. So what's the message then to the folks in these communities to say, pump the brakes, these other options are also really viable and not as difficult as some people might think?
I'd encourage people to think about the places that they like to go. Think about the places they like to visit. Do they like to visit Boston? Do they like to visit New York City? Frankly, do they like to visit Disney World, which is this recreation of what we have right here in New York State in terms of a sense of place and a main street, right? Everybody likes to walk down the main street. And then look around and notice what you have. Lyons is a great example. It's a newly expanded National Register Historic District, and it's got beautiful buildings and a lot of potential, and capitalizing on what makes your place special. What's different between Lyons and Seneca Falls and Geneva, because each one of them is unique and each one of them has their own character, as does every single place around the state. And so really thinking about that and thinking about where people choose to be, where people gravitate towards, and then realizing that you have that in your backyard, and how to grow that, and then go to those businesses, go to that coffee shop, go to the movie theater on Main Street, go to your local gift shop. Support those places, and get out of your car and walk around. It's easy on this day because it's gorgeous right now, but I know that's harder said, in the middle of February. But it does make a difference.
Thanks for listening, guys. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can also subscribe or follow Inside the FLX on Spotify and a lot of other podcasting platforms too. If you'd like to follow along with me, I'm on Twitter. My handle is @FLXJosh. Thanks to my guests today, and of course, thanks again to you for listening. We will see you next time.
Finger Lakes one.